Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone, based on your time zone. Welcome in Salesforce Epics Hour. And today we are going to talk about what's wrong with my JavaScript. And our speaker is Aditya. He's a senior developer evangelist from the Salesforce. And my name is Amit Chaudhary. I'm the founder of the Epics Hour and the co-organizer of the Fermentation Developer Group. So if you want to follow me, you can follow me on Amit_SFDC or ApexR for all upcoming session announcement. So I will not take your much time. Let me hand over to Aditya. Aditya, hand over to you.
Hey, thanks, Amit. Hi, everyone. This is my first time on ApexR, so thank you, Amit, for inviting me to be a part of this. My name is Aditya. I work as a senior developer evangelist at Salesforce. You can follow me on my Twitter handle that is right under my photo. I frequently speak at many in-person and online events around the world. Not sure how many of you have already attended my sessions at maybe Dreamforce or Trailhead DX. I also happen to start and lead the Hyderabad Marketing Cloud user group, now called as B2C Marketers Group, before I joined Salesforce. So that was a group which I was running back then. So I'm also 13x certified and a 2x ranger. That is in a nutshell about me. And let me go to the next slide. Yeah, so today's agenda. So primarily, this is a talk that I had already given at Dreamforce, and I thought it is a good thing to share across different audiences now that this is being recorded, because unfortunately my talk at Dreamforce was not recorded. So this is a good way to make more people be aware of this important topic. So I'm going to cover a little bit of how JavaScript has evolved and what is the shorthand syntax that you can use with the new JavaScript framework. Not exactly framework, but standard is what I would say. Then we are going to focus, so the majority of the session, we are going to focus on what are the common mistakes that you can make. And finally, I'm going to cover a little bit about the ESLint tool. So yeah, before I get into anything, this is a slide that I think all of you are very familiar with. So please don't make your purchasing decisions based on any statements that I might make today. Please follow the official documentation and official website in order to make your decisions. And this is a slide I thought would be a good start for today's session given the current state of the world. So I hope that all of you are focusing on your health and safety of both yourself and your family members. And as we all continue to navigate this confusing time that is for all of us, we from Team Trailhead and Salesforce want to let you guys know that we are here for you. And to know what is it that we are doing to support our community, please visit the link on the slide here. So this is a blog written by Sarah Franklin, our head of Trailhead Marketing and Trailblazers. So she has very beautifully written down what exactly we are doing to support our community. So please go through this blog. So coming to our topic today, that is what's wrong with our JavaScript. So I first want to start with the evolution of JavaScript. And the reason this is important is, as you have already seen, there is a fundamental shift in how Salesforce development stack has changed. So right from Visualforce to Lightning Web Components. Increasingly, we are now reliant on JavaScript for most of the front end, rather all of the front end. And JavaScript is a core part of it. And Lightning Web Components is heavily focused on JavaScript standards. So it is important that every developer knows what are the latest advancements in JavaScript and why is it becoming so important. So if you look at the timeline, you can see that until 2015, not a lot has happened on JavaScript. Very minimal updates So like you can see after 1999, there is a huge 10-year gap before which there are any new updates that have been rolled out. But after 2015, when ES6 was published, you can see that there are a lot more updates happening, and this is what we call as the modern JavaScript era. And Salesforce happens to be a part of these standard organizations, that is W3C and TC39, that primarily is driving the web standards forward. So we are very closely related with them. We kind of take your voice back. So you can feel free to reach out to us with any suggestions, and we can take it directly to the standards organization so that it becomes a part of a larger JavaScript standard. So there's a whole lot of things happening in JavaScript advancements, and like I already mentioned, Salesforce is a very integral part of it. Now, modern JavaScript, as you know, our entire Lightning Web Component framework is totally based on modern JavaScript. And what modern JavaScript has given us is shorthand syntax. So that is not just the only one. Actually, there is a lot of things that modern JavaScript has achieved, including your web component standard, the templates, ECMAScript classes, and stuff like that. But I thought for our session today, I would rather focus on shorthand syntax and then get into the common mistakes made. And the reason shorthand syntax I want to cover is most of the recipes that you have. So those of you who have started learning Lightning Web Components, you would have noticed that we frequently keep referring to this sample app. That is the recipes sample app, which has code snippets on how you can use Lightning Web Components to code for specific tasks. So all of those recipes, all of the documentation, also the code that we write, the code that we put in as an example, it always follows all the best practices, and most likely we tend to use these shorthand syntaxes. So the reason I want to cover this is because you guys will get familiar with it, and it won't seem like a very new thing that has been launched. So that's the primary intention. So starting with the declaring an object shorthand syntax, if you can see, I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but the first red box is how you would typically declare an object, where you give the key of an object and then the value. So here the key is first name and the value is the name of the variable. And here the variable is declared on the top. But what you'll notice here is the name of the key and the name of the variable both are the same. So instead of writing it repetitively like this, what you can do with shorthand syntax is just put it once in the curly braces. So this syntax would essentially mean the same thing where it is an object. And primarily where you would find this syntax is whenever you're wiring a method to a function, or if you're calling an apex method imperatively, what you would see is the data and error, which would be represented using the shorthand syntax. Now at first, whenever you look at the syntax, it might look as if those both are parameters. But if you notice closely, it is actually having curly braces, which is why it is the shorthand syntax of an object. So which is why, unlike parameters, if you change the name here, if you say first name 1 or something, it would essentially break your code because it is not a parameter. And first name 1 in the shorthand syntax essentially means first name 1 colon first name 1. So unless you have a variable with the name first name 1, it would get messy. So please remember this, anything with curly braces and just a name is a shorthand syntax for an object. Now the next one, arrays. I think this is most frequently used because whenever you have a list of records, you would be using an array. And this is same across every programming language where you access numbers based on a zero-based index. So the third number is going to be numbers of 2, not much to cover over there. But in the new way, what you can see is that with the syntax of, let's say you declare a square bracket and then you define some variable names, what it would mean is automatically the index would go into these variables. So this is what we call as destructuring, deconstructing. And that is what this syntax is doing. So in case you want to access only the number 3, so you would just put 2 commas and you would declare a variable name, and automatically the third index would come into this variable. So this is an easier way to do things when compared to this one. And this is not sort of mandatory. You can use it if you want, but just so that you don't get scared when you look at a new syntax, I'm just covering this. So the next one, pretty interesting one actually, and pretty useful. And this is all about string concatenation. So this is the old school way of doing string concatenation, where you have a bunch of strings and you use the plus operator to concatenate. And initially it would seem easy, but the more and more complex your string gets, for example, you have these special characters like single quotes or double quotes, you will have to escape them. Or let's say if you have a complex HTML string that you're creating in JavaScript to push to the front end, you would be writing a lot of concatenation operators, and sometimes you would spend a lot of time figuring out where you want to append variables. But now with the shorthand syntax, it is pretty easy. So instead of declaring a string using single or double quotes, you would be using this character called as tilde. I don't know if I'm spelling it correctly or not, but this is the character that nobody frequently uses. So the one beside your number 1 key, the character that everyone rarely uses, that is what is being used here. So you put that and you would just write the string the way it is supposed to be. And wherever you want to have dynamic variables, you would use the $ along with curly braces. And what you can see here is that where I'm using single quotes, or I can use double quotes. So essentially, I need not really escape any characters. I can just type my string the way it is supposed to look. And wherever the variable is supposed to be put dynamically, I just use the $ and curly braces, and it's going to pick up the variable name and it's going to print this way. So you can see that the syntax is considerably tilde is a top character, backtick is one. Oh, okay, sorry, my bad. That is true. So if it is a backtick, yes. So yes, so you use that character and then the variable name would be put into that. So this is a pretty easy way. Try to use it as much as possible. All our examples use this instead of concatenating a string using the plus operator. And then moving to the most interesting part, which is anonymous functions. This is pretty much used everywhere, where in the old way, what you would do to declare an anonymous function is you would write the function keyword, have parameters, and then you would return some value. Anonymous functions, it is called anonymous because it doesn't really have a function name. And typically your anonymous functions would be your callback functions. So anytime you are getting data from the server or you're doing an asynchronous operation, all your callback functions are going to be anonymous. So this is the old school way of writing it. But in the new way, we use something called as an arrow function. And the reason we call it as an arrow function is we use this fat arrow syntax, where you would not use the function keyword essentially. You would just have empty braces. In case you have parameters, you would put those parameters in here. If you don't have any parameters, it is just going to be open and close braces. And then you would use a fat arrow syntax, and whatever is the operation that you write here is going to be returned. So essentially not a lot of standard keywords is what you would be using. The syntax is pretty much simplified. And this is used everywhere in our examples. And you would notice there are certain differences between declaring an anonymous function the old way and a new way, which I'm going to cover in the subsequent slides. But just note that wherever you find this syntax, it is an anonymous function which returns some value. So this is pretty much about shorthand syntax. Now what we are going to do is we are going to take a look at a use case. So pretty much I said my talk is about what's wrong with my JavaScript code. So what I'm going to show you is a use case and how it works. Of course, because it is a demo, it is not going to work as expected. That is the whole point of this talk. It won't work as expected, but then we are going to look at why, and then we are going to try and fix it. So here is my use case. So I have a form here that creates a case, which primarily accepts an email address. And once I have the email address, I hit on search. And then if a contact already exists, it's going to show me the contact details, and it's going to show me a form in order to create a case. But what I see is that the moment I click on search, there is an error that occurs, but I'm getting all of these form details as well. The way I've written the code is, if I don't enter an email address, I wanted to see an alert that says, please enter an email address, but somehow that doesn't work. And then I have all of these details. And what I've also coded it here is a small pop-up to appear after 5 seconds, just to prompt the user if they need any help. So the functionality is that you would be seeing these chat with me pop-ups on different websites. So in case you're stuck, you can feel free to chat. So that is a functionality I tried to put here, but somehow that pop-up is also not appearing. So let's take a look at the code, and we will see why. So here is a simple lighting web component class. I have a few variables. I have a return option. And here in the connected callback, you can see I have a set timeout function with a 3-second delay. And within those 3 seconds, I'm setting the show help box to true. Ideally, which means after the component is loaded, 3 seconds later, this gets set to true. And then the pop-up is supposed to show up, but this is somehow not happening. And in the handle email change, so the moment I enter the email address, I want to query for the data and then show some results. But if you look at this, none of my validations are working. So in case my validation worked, I'm firing a query to get all the details of the user to show on the screen. And if my email address was not null, I was supposed to not show, if my email address was blank, I was supposed to not show the remaining form, but that syntax doesn't seem to be working either. And finally, I have a route to chat. So here the intention is once my chat with me box shows up, I can click on it and I would essentially create an event to show in different places. So I have created an event and I'm dispatching that event by passing whatever input values have been given. So, so this is all the functionality that I have built. The intention is just to show you how the code is written. And obviously those of you who are already experts in JavaScript would notice everything that is wrong with it. But if not, I'm going to show you everything that is wrong with this code and the reason why this code is not working. Go back to our slides. And the very first problem with JavaScript is type coercion. Now, what really type coercion is, so take a look at the example on the screen. I have, let's say I have 2 fields on the UI, number 1 and number 2, and I want to add both of those numbers. So here I'm just writing a simple query selector to get the value of those numbers, and I'm adding number 1 plus number 2, and I'm trying to print what the sum is. So ideally, if the input is 2 and 4, I would expect the value to be 6. But then you would notice that the sum that is printed is going to be 24. The reason for that is type coercion, which means even though you as an end user know that this is a number, JavaScript essentially doesn't know that, so it treats it as a string by default. And once you try to add 2 strings, it essentially concatenates both of those strings and it makes it 24. So that is what is type coercion in its simplest forms. So if you don't explicitly typecast into whatever data type that you are expecting, you might find results that won't work for you. So here is a small example. So what I try to do in in-person events is I try to play a quiz with this, but now I can just show it to you. What is the output? So 2 plus 2 is 4. Everyone knows that. Now, when you add 2 and 2 as strings, it is 22. That is also straightforward. Now, when I do 2 plus 2 minus 2, all of them are numbers. So my answer is going to be 2. But what happens if I do 2 plus 2 minus 2 when everything is a string? So the way it works is, so I get a variety of answers for this, but the right answer is going to be 20, because when JavaScript evaluates an expression from left to right, it sees two strings, it concatenates both of them, because the plus operator can be both an addition operator versus a concatenation operator. So that is the type coercion problem. But the moment you use minus, minus is always a numerical operation. So JavaScript tries to convert both of the operands to the same data type, which is number, which is why you get 22 minus 2, which is 20. Now, if you look at the next expression, that is 3 as a string plus 4 plus 5, again, evaluating from left to right, because it is a string, everything else also becomes a string. So the answer is going to be 345. But what happens if it is 3 plus 4 and 5 is a string? Again, evaluate from left to right. 3 plus 4, both are numbers. So the answer is going to be 7. And the moment it encounters a string, it converts all of it to a string. So the answer becomes 75. So a pretty interesting way to look at type coercion. And you can see clearly that unless you really know what are the data types, you can't predict the result unless you know how JavaScript does things. So as a best practice, what we recommend is try to convert it into the relevant data types. So in here, if you look at it, we have converted both of the strings or both of the variables into the data type that we are expecting. So here I want both of them to be treated as numbers. So I explicitly typecast them into numbers. So that is the fix for type coercion. Please be careful, because these are some of the things that you won't find so easily unless you are testing for it. So these are the cases where you do a positive testing when you're a developer, but then when it goes to the QA, they test with random values and then unexpected results pop out. So this is one of the causes. So please be careful. The sum is 6 now because both of them are converted to numbers. Now the next frequently made mistake is not understanding the difference between null and undefined. So here is an expression, here is a function. So I have a string variable, and if the string is not equal to null, I want to convert it to uppercase. So let's say that is my example. So this is pretty much what every one does, because you don't want to get the attempt to dereference a null object or stuff like that. So you would always, as a best practice, check if a variable is null before calling a function on it. So this is what this function is doing. But what you'll notice is the string not equal to null is going to return true, which means it is going to go inside this loop and it results in an exception. So even though you have nicely added a conditional statement, checking it with null might not result in what you might expect. And what you'll also notice is the not equal to operator is I'm using a double equal to, because that is again one of the best practices in JavaScript, where you would not use double equal to or not equal to sign. So the not equal to sign generally contains an exclamation mark and a single equals sign. That is not something that is a best practice. You would always use the double equals or the triple equals whenever you're equating values. So as a best practice, you would be using that. Now, this is a problem with this function. And why is that? It has got to do with how JavaScript treats a variable which is undeclared. So here in line number 1, I have a variable which is just declared but not initialized. And when I try to print it, it prints undefined. So unlike other programming languages where it prints null, JavaScript treats it to be undefined. And undefined is not equals to null. So if you use the triple equals operator, like I said, it's a best practice. Undefined is not equal to null because primarily the data types are different. Undefined always equals to the type undefined. So that is primarily one thing that all of you need to remember, that all the uninitialized variables um, are initialized to undefined, and it only equals undefined, it doesn't equal to null. Now, what about this example? So the previous example is only when you write your own JavaScript code. But what about this example where you're trying to query the HTML? And what if there is no input node? So let's say you have an HTML page. You're expecting to get the value of a certain uh, I don't know what it's called, node. But what if there is no input node, and what do you expect the value of line number 3 to be? So the line number 3 value is going to be null this time. I'm going to explain why. And of course, line number 5 and 6, if you see, null equals null and null is not equal to undefined. So, okay, let me go back here. So now why is this happening? What is the real difference between null and undefined? So in JavaScript, null is also kind of a value that a variable holds. So initially in the previous example, you have seen you have declared a variable but not initialized it. In that case, it holds undefined. But what you can do is you can assign a variable the value of null. So I can write where email node is equal to null, in which case email node becomes null. If you don't assign something to it, it is always equal to undefined. And in this particular example, how did null get assigned to this email node? So if you notice, the right side of the equation has the query selector of input. Now the query selector tries to find HTML elements, and if it is not able to find any HTML element, it returns a value of null, which then gets assigned to a variable, which is why in this case, the value is null versus in the previous case, it is undefined. So as a rule of thumb, always remember that a variable is null only if it has been assigned the value of null. So that is the thumb rule that JavaScript goes by. So in the previous example, we have in the first thing about what is wrong. I have an object, I'm trying to not equate it to null. It's not really correct because as I described, this variable has not been assigned to anything. So ideally I'll have to use undefined instead of null. And now this is going to return false and my equation becomes correct. So very important to note, whenever you're trying to use query selectors and all, if the HTML element is not found, it returns null, which is when the value becomes null. In all other cases, it's going to be equal to undefined. So this is the real truth behind null and undefined. But what most of the developers have seen them doing is they just write an if condition. They say if object not equal to null and object not equal to undefined, which is in a way okay, but that means you're not really understanding what the variable really holds. You're just checking for all possibilities, which might result in bugs in the future. So it is important to know what a variable holds and why. Now the next one is incorrect references to this. So there is a small meme for this that I try to put, which basically says when you think you understood what this is, but then you can't remember what this refers to. This is, I think, the most faced headache, or I would rather say you might probably want to pull out your hair whenever you encounter issues with regards to this. So it's very important to remember or understand what this refers to. So here is a beautiful or a longer example. which is very similar to the code snippet that I have shown you earlier, where I'm trying to initialize a value to false, and then I'm trying to show the pop-up after 3 seconds. So this is almost the same code snippet. So this is a class. I have a property welcome message, and in the rendered callback, I'm trying to print console log this dot welcome message. And then I have a set timeout function. And in the timeout function, I'm waiting for 300 milliseconds, and then I'm trying to print the same welcome message. But what you'll notice is the first console log that says this dot welcome message prints hello world as expected, because the this here refers to the same class, and then it already holds the value hello world, so it prints it. But when I use the same value here, it returns undefined. And why is that? That is because this keyword that is used refers to the enclosing function. That is the set timeout function. Okay, so there are two questions here. How about where object is equal to null? Yeah, you can definitely do that. You can initialize a property to null, and then in which case you could obviously use object not equals to null. But in case you don't do that, it is undefined. So yes, once you understand this difference, which you clearly understood right now, you can initialize it to null and then continue using null. But if you don't initialize it, is undefined. Now, the next question is about how come the welcome message doesn't have where or let. Where or let is because welcome message right here, it is within a class, and this is a Lightning Web component. And welcome message is a property of this class. So whenever you declare class properties, you need not use where or let, which is why your welcome message need not have anything, because these are class properties and not variables. So that is another terminology that all of you need to be aware of. So inside a function, you can create any number of variables that you want. So you can create using let or where or const. But here inside a class, if you're trying to declare something, it is treated as a class property and not a variable. So that is why it doesn't contain any initialization keywords. So yeah, coming back to this. So this here refers to the enclosing function. And there is this concept called as lexical scope, or the normal scope, or whatever you call it. Lexical scope is quite a complex topic. I would recommend all of you to go and read more standard articles around it. But in JavaScript, everything is function scoped. So what does a function scope mean? Whenever you declare a property or a variable inside a function, the scope of that variable is limited to that function only. Now, in this case, this keyword, because it refers to the enclosing function, and this function, that is these 3 lines, this function doesn't have a variable with the name welcome message, which is why this dot welcome message returns undefined. This function doesn't refer to anything around it. So the welcome message property that your class has is not accessible here. So that is all that you need to remember. If I explain more, it might get more confusing. So whenever you have a function, anonymous function here, and then you have declared something, please note, anything that you write inside this is function scoped, and you try to use this, it refers to the enclosing function, and unless you declare a variable inside it, it will be inaccessible. Now, what is the fix for this is you can assign the standard this to a local variable. So inside my rendered callback, I have declared a local variable called original this. I can name it whatever I want. I can call it ABC. But what I'm doing is I'm assigning the this to that local variable. And what I can do, I can use that local variable inside my function. Now, what happens with this syntax is the original this is no longer the standard this keyword. So its behavior is not dependent on all of the scoping. Whereas I mentioned something called as lexical scope, where a function keeps in mind the variables that are above it. It's a complex concept. I would rather not explain it in a 1 hour session, but just remember it as a rule of thumb. So inside anonymous functions, if you want to use the standard this keyword, don't. Instead, assign the this keyword to a local variable and use the local variable. And it will continue to work. The internal workings, all of you can do a trial and error and understand more. But remember this term as lexical scope and then Google about it. Now, this is the technical fix for that. But now, when I was talking initially about these arrow functions, I said they have a different use as well. So that is where um, I'm going to show you another example. Hopefully this will be more confusing. The more confused you are, the more you will learn JavaScript. That is the way it works. So here, if you look at the same example, I have a welcome message property, then I have a console log statement. And now in the set timeout, instead of using the anonymous function with the previous syntax, now I'm using the fat arrow syntax. And then I'm declaring a function. And then here I put the same console log statement. But this time what you'll notice is the value gets printed. It doesn't say undefined anymore. Now the reason for that is this fat arrow syntax, the way you declare an anonymous function has special properties. That is, these arrow functions, they inherit the this from its parent. So here the parent is the rendered callback. And in rendered callback, this refers to the class. So everything is printed as expected. Now, because the arrow function is inheriting this from its parent, it continues to refer to the same class. Now, that is the primary difference between using an arrow function versus an anonymous function. So in the previous example, you're using an anonymous function with the previous syntax. If you use this syntax, the this is not inherited, which is when you will have to assign it to a local variable. But if you use the arrow function, your this is inherited, which means you can continue to use the standard this property, which makes your code more cleaner and easy to understand and more predictable. So our recommendation is to always use an arrow function, which is why all our LWC examples use this arrow function itself. So I'm going to stop there and look at a few questions. What would happen if we have one more function within set timeout? Lexical way will work in this case. So yes, it totally depends on how you are chaining functions. So in the previous example, if you would use another set timeout inside it, I would still recommend you use this local variable in order to assign it, because it is more, you can expect the code to behave the way you want. But whenever you're using arrow functions, the advantage is you can nest it how much ever you want. So you can have 2 levels of set timeouts, and then you can have an imperative call to apex. And as long as all of your chain of commands is using the arrow function, you can use the standard this keyword even in the last function of your chain. To be really frank, I haven't given it a try of multiple functions using the function keyword and how lexical scope behaves that way. That is a food for thought. We can definitely experiment and see how it works. But I have definitely tested how it works by chaining multiple arrow functions, and it works the way it is supposed to. More questions. Why can't you type console log original this? Okay, this is from way back. I'll try to answer it a little bit later. So can we use dot bind this, and isn't the let keyword optional? Like we didn't use the let keyword for welcome message variable. Okay, I haven't really used bind, so I can't really comment on it. Sorry for that. But why can't you use the let? So like I mentioned, whenever you use, so whatever you declare inside the class is a property versus whatever you declare inside a function is called a variable. Properties don't need let or const, but inside it you would definitely need let or um, var or const. So that is a primary difference. So, okay, I think this is enough confusion. Yeah, this is just to make you guys aware of more than anything, what I wanted to let you know with this is how arrow functions and anonymous functions with the function keyword behave differently and how this works. Anything more complex, even I would need to experiment it in my console and see how the output behaves. Um, any complex questions, please reach out to me on Twitter. We both can debug it. Because if I talk anything more about this, I think people are bound to get more confused and go away from JavaScript altogether, which we don't want. So let me go to the next topic. So the moral of this particular section is use arrow functions a lot because arrow functions inherit this keyword, which means you need not do all of that variable assignments and all of that random stuff. And then you can continue to use this dot welcome message and everything would continue to work the way you expect it to work. So that is the key takeaway from all of this. So the next topic is data references and leaks. So this is not really a memory leak because that is an overall different concept, but this is pretty much talking about data and how data references, the way you refer to data impacts your logic. So here I have a small code snippet. Let me look at, I figured out, okay. Okay. So
Aditya,
here's the code.
you can continue. We can take the question answer in the last 15 minutes.
Okay, I mean, I just prefer to do it this
Yeah.
way because section wise I can clarify the questions because it becomes difficult for me also to go back all the slides.
Okay. If you're comfortable, then fine. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, yeah. So here with data references and leaks, this is a very good example where there is a use case in which there is a parent component and there is a child component. And what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to send an event from the child component to the parent component. So for that, in my child components class, I have a variable or a class property which has the object that is count :0. And then I have a function called send object, which is trying to dispatch a custom event of notify. And I'm trying to pass in the detail this dot object. And I'm dispatching the event. So pretty simple stuff. This is how you would send events from child to parent, where I'm sending this object. Now, how would a parent receive it? So this is my parent component and I have an event handler that is handling this data. So I'm getting event.detail. I'm assigning it to a local property that is data received. And then what I have here is an update data function. What this function is doing is whenever this function is called, it would increment the count. So what would happen here? The count of 0 is being sent from child to parent. And in the parent, it is being stored in the data received property. And there is a function called update data, which keeps incrementing the value of this count property. So pretty simple stuff. You would think it works as expected and it does work, but it behaves in a little bit of a weird way, which is what I'm going to show you. So here in this demo, I have this event data leak as a tab that I created. So this is my component. I've repeated it 3 times. You'll know why. So here is the component. Here is my child component where I have the data that is count 0. And I have this button on click of which the event is going to go from the child to parent. And you can see the moment I click send data, the parent has received this value. And now the add one is going to call the function that increments this value. And notice what happens the moment I click add one. So you'll see that the moment I'm clicking add one in the parent, the value in the child is also being updated. So now this really is what we call a data leak, as long as you're not expecting this to happen. So if you want this to happen, well and good. But if that is something that you don't want to happen, so let's say once you pass the data from child to parent, any updates to data that happen in the parent should not reflect in the child. And that is a best practice because that would result in your data skew and all of that. It would return unexpected results. But now notice what happens. It is the same component that I have repeated, but now instead of sending an object, I'm just sending a number. So previously I sent count colon 0, but now I'm just sending 0. So I click send data. The data comes to the parent, and now I add 1 on the parent. And you'll notice that only the data in the parent is changing, but the data in the child is not changing. Now, there is a reason for this, and that reason is the most commonly used terminology across all programming languages, that is pass by value versus pass by reference. So to explain it, here is a very tiny example. Here I have a string hello world. I'm assigning the string to another string, and I'm trying to print both of them. As expected, both of them are hello worlds. But now what if I change another string to hello Dreamforce? So only the another string has changed, as you can see in the output, whereas the original string still retains its value, that is hello world. Now this is what we call pass by value, and all of the primitive data types are passed by value. Primitive data types meaning string, numbers, all of those are passed by value, which means any changes to the second variable will not impact the original variable. But notice the other example where instead of having a string, now I have an object. The object has the first name and last name, Tony and Stark. Now I'm assigning the object to another object, object 2. As expected, both of them print the same thing. But notice what happens the moment I update the property of a second object. So object 2.firstName, if I change it to Morgan, you'll notice both my original object and the second object have changed. This is because non-primitive data types are passed by reference. So in this case, an object is a non-primitive data type, and it is passed by reference, which means the moment I run an assignment syntax, that is line number 2, both object 2 and object 1, they point to the same value. So even though I'm saying object 2.firstName, indirectly I'm referring to the same value. So object 1, since it is also referring to the same value, both of them return the same result, because all your non-primitive data types are passed by reference, and this is very important. And that is what has happened in my example previously. When I passed a number, it was a primitive data type, so it was only passed by value. So any changes to my parent component did not change the child component. So that I'm going to show you with a little bit of an arrow mark. So this object that I sent from child to parent, because it is a non-primitive data type, it has been passed by reference, which means now any changes I make in the parent component, it would reflect in the child as well, because there is a reference that is maintained. And this is what we call as a state leak. And this might impact your business logic, or it is in some cases a security flaw as well, because the data in your child is being impacted by a parent, which means any malicious client can update the value of your own component. So that is technically considered a security flaw. So what is the fix for this? The fix is actually very simple. You will have to convert your non-primitive data types to primitive data types. So in case of an object like this, you can always stringify it, like it is shown in line number 5. If you stringify, it gets passed as a string. But in cases where you're not able to stringify an object, because object necessarily need not always be in a JSON structure. So in that case, you will have to use the object.assign syntax, which is essentially cloning your object. And now I'm going to use a clone syntax as opposed to just assigning it to a different variable. Because as you have seen, if you just assign it to a different variable, it is again a pass by reference. It is not technically a clone. So this syntax is going to clone my object. And now with that, what is going to happen? Coming back to our example, I have applied the fix in the third component where I'm stringifying this value and sending it. So now I send the data comes to the parent. And now if I add 1 on the parent, only the parent value is updated, but not the child, because I'm either stringifying it or cloning the object. So I'm actually keeping my child data isolated and sending a copy of the data to the parent. So this is one of the most commonly found bugs because, and if you notice, I picked up the example of dispatching events because most of the times you would be dispatching an event and the detail that you would be passing might always be an object. Let it be an error that you're dispatching or some data from the child to the parent. Most of the cases you would be sending JSON data itself. So please keep in mind, stringify the JSON data and send. If not, changes to the parent will be reflected in the child as well. It's just something to keep in mind, but if really your functionality expects that data change in the parent must be updated in the child, by all means, you can just pass it by reference, but just remember that this might happen. Now, until now, what all I've covered is all about general JavaScript. But now when it comes to Salesforce specific stuff, insecure code. So here I have a function and here I have an SOQL statement. Of course, you will now notice that you are able to understand this syntax where it is the modern way of string concatenation. You can see how easy it is to now understand instead of a bunch of plus operators. So I have a SOQL statement and then I'm querying some data. And the way I'm doing it is I have a fire query as an Apex method. I'm importing that Apex method. I'm firing it imperatively. Now this might look correct. So any filter conditions that I apply in the front end, I'm able to build my query here. And all my Apex logic is doing is it is firing that query and returning the results. So even though technically this works and this is correct, it is a major security flaw because your SOQL query is exposed to the browser. So any user, they can open Chrome developer tools or Google Mozilla Firebug or whatever is the front-end tool of their choice. They can open this code, they can look at this code, and the worst part is they can edit this as well. So you have nicely built all your filter conditions. And if your security model is not correct, they could ideally send select ID from user, which would expose all the user details or details that they're not expecting to see. So this is a major security flaw. So this is a example. So here you can see that the entire query is visible in my developer tools, and I just updated it from accounts to users. And now I'm running the same, I'm clicking on the same button. Now the users are being returned. So I let it run one more time. Accounts have come. I'm updating the query right in the browser to return users. And I'm saying show accounts, and then all my users are being returned. So you can see that this is a major security flaw. Of course, there is another side of the argument that says, as long as my Apex method uses with sharing and it has implemented all the relevant security rules, this should not really be a problem, which is to some extent true. But to be very frank, both you and I know that in most of the projects, we continue to use Apex classes without sharing. So it is always a best practice to not expose your queries to the front end. And this also applies to any sensitive information. So whenever you're making a call out to a third party system, don't pass the username and password from the client. Always do callouts from your Apex class itself. Okay, so now I just jumped the gun. So here is the same another example where you can use a fetch API in order to call some third-party API. And what is happening here is you're passing the authorization header where you're passing username and password in plain text. And this is also exposed to the user, huge security flaw. So what is the best fix for this? Use Apex for all business logic. Never trust the data coming from the client. So always ensure you have your own security that is built into your backend. And one most frequently thought of misconception is that minification is a security feature. So ideally, when you're minifying your code, it doesn't mean that your code is encrypted. Minification is just a way of reducing your JavaScript size by removing all the line breaks, replacing all the variables with, if you declared a variable with the name, let's say somewhere, it would ideally be replaced with A, B, C or something like that, just so that your overall JavaScript size is reduced. So minification is not a security feature. So don't just think that I have minified my code so it is secure. And inefficient DOM access is the next one. So here, let's say I have a template. This is the HTML part of a Lightning Web component. I have an input tag. It has the type text, name is fname, ID is fname, and class is fname. And I'm using the query selector in order to get the value of this fname input. Now, this would say fname is not defined because I'm using the hash selector. So the hash is ideally an ID selector. And even though I've declared my ID to be fname, it doesn't really work that way because during the runtime, Lightning Web Components, the framework automatically creates globally unique IDs. So even though you have defined the ID to be fname, during the runtime, it is replaced with a globally unique ID. Whereas your classes and the name attribute is going to retain its original value. So which is why never use IDs whenever you're running a query selector. Try to use class names or try to use the name attribute. And you can use that using this syntax. And this is always considered a best practice and a most efficient way of accessing DOM. Now, the other most frequently misused way is to create HTML in JavaScript, and then you'll be using the create elements and append childs and all of that logic in order to append HTML to the DOM. So that is one most frequently used way. And the other one is in case you want to hide and show elements, you would ideally write this. You'll say style.display is equal to none. And what it would do is essentially hide or show the elements. So this is a very inefficient way of doing it because changing HTML through JavaScript is always expensive. And hiding and showing a component using just CSS styles would result in a performance degradation because your component is already present in the DOM, but you're not showing it to the user, and this impacts performance. Ideally, if you don't want to show a component to the user, it should be destroyed and not be present in the DOM altogether. So frequently, I see developers using this, which will result in performance degradation. Now, the best way is to use the standard directives, that is template for each or template if true. In case of Aura, you have Aura iteration and then you have Aura if. And what you would ideally do in case you have the functionality that says add row and then you're creating a bunch of HTML for it, you would replace it with a JavaScript equivalent where you declare an array with different values and you would iterate over all of those. So each time you click on add row, you would push a new element to the array and automatically your HTML will be updated. Now, in case of hiding and showing sections, you would have a Boolean property in your class, and then you would use it in the template if true. And that is the most efficient way of doing it, because everything that is not shown is by default destroyed by the framework, which makes your page more efficient. So this is again a best practice to be used. Now this is inefficient loops, a pretty simple fix that you can put. Now in this case, I have an array of 10,000 values. This is a regular for statement where I'm iterating over all of the values. Now what's really wrong with it is, for every iteration, array.length is calculated, and this is expensive because for 10,000 times you're recalculating array length. So instead of that, what you can do is, even before running your for loop, just put the length in a different variable and use that variable, so that some amount of time is saved. I mean, there's a very minute improvement in performance, but the more number of elements you're iterating over, performance is exponentially impacted. But then there is a different way, and this is again the latest ECMAScript syntax, where you can just say array.for each and then use this arrow function in order to iterate over each element. And this is what we call as higher order functions, which is a way, it is more efficient, I would say, and recommended as a best practice. Just because I use the word efficient, it doesn't mean you'll be noticing a huge performance improvement. There is a very minor performance improvement that typically users won't be able to detect, because code is anyways fast. Iteration happens fairly quickly. Using this, it happens slightly more quickly. Just as a best practice, I wanted to share it across. So these are all of the fixes that I have done. Let's apply these fixes to our use case, which I've already done, and I've put it in a side-by-side compare. So in the very first change, you'll notice that my fire query apex function, apex method, initially it was just taking a string as a query, and it was just running that query. But what I've done is I've refactored it to a different method, so that I don't accept an SOQL query, but I just accept a few parameters and I run my own SOQL query. And coming to the connected callback, here I'm using the set timeout function with the standard function syntax, which is why after 3 seconds when I'm using this.show help box, it was really not affecting the property on line number 9, because show help box, as you know, it is limited to the scope of this function. Now the fix is I've changed it to an arrow function, which means this is inherited. And if I use this.show help box, it updates the property in line number 9. So this is a very simple fix I've done to my code. And now when it comes to handle email change, you'll notice I've used an ID selector. I've changed it to a name selector. And I was using email address not equal to null. So ideally, it's correct. I didn't really change it because email address is assigned to a template query selector, which means if this is not found, ideally it would be null. So this is correct. But then I've just added an email address dot length greater than 0. So in case it is blank, I would run this logic. Now inside this logic, you can see that I added something here. On line number 30, previously I used to hide and show elements using the styles. And as we discussed, it is not a best practice. So I replaced it with a Boolean variable. And now my fire query, which was in the beginning taking this huge SOQL statement, which is a security flaw. Now I'm just passing email address as a parameter, and the SOQL is being run in the Apex itself. Now here you'll notice the contact, that is the return result of this null. I was previously checking if it is not equal to null, but now I'm checking it to be not equal to undefined, because as you can see, this is just a variable. It is not coming from HTML. So there is a high chance that this is going to be undefined. And here, contact.account not equal to null, which is a good way of doing it. But then there is a more efficient way if you want to check if a key is present in an object or not. So if contact is a JavaScript object, you can just say account in contact, and it would return true or false. You need not really write not equal to null and then worry if it is null or undefined that you have to check for. You can just say account in contact. So finally, this is again the style.display is replaced with a Boolean variable. And when it comes to dispatch event, I was just sending all my record input, a JSON that I created in line number 46, API name and all the fields that are captured. I was passing it in the detail. But as we've seen, this might result in some data leak. So what I'm doing is I'm stringifying the data to pass it as a primitive value. So these are all the fixes that I have applied, which makes this code more efficient and bug-free. Again, this is a very simple example that I have crafted, but these topics will definitely make use cases. Finally, coming to ESLint. So I've spoken a lot about JavaScript and what is a best practice and what is not. So you as a developer, you need not really go through a lot of documentation to remember all of this. ESLint is a tool that comes bundled with your developer tools in VS Code. So every time you write JavaScript, ESLint runs in the background and it sort of underlines everything that is wrong. So it enforces you to use triple equals, and it disallows you to use alerts, console logs. It disallows assignment to undeclared variables. So all of the best practices that are out there about JavaScript, ESLint as a tool is going to enforce them. And this is a plugin that is directly available in VS Code. It comes bundled along with your extension pack. So please, anyways, for Lightning Web components, you're going to use VS Code. But those of you who are working in Aura, please try to use VS Code as much as possible, because it's going to help you with JavaScript in that as well. Finally, learning the resources. Please complete this trail that is learn to work with JavaScript. It's a pretty useful trail which contains most of the topics that I have covered today, along with the different examples and links to various documentations. So please feel free to complete this trail, and these are some of the other resources that I have tried to refer to when I was preparing for this presentation. Again, as you can see, all of these are not specific to Salesforce, because LWC is largely based on web standards. Standard JavaScript principles definitely apply here as well. So these are learning resources. I think this slide deck will be shared with you. You can click on these links. And then this is the Apex Hours. Again, I want to thank Amit for giving me this opportunity to present with Apex Hours. Here are all the links. I think you're going to post the video recording over there as well. Let me take a few questions. Wasn't the method you imported changed to get contact instead of fire query? Yes. So let me quickly show that. Okay, it was there in VS Code. So what you'll notice is I have only changed the import method. So fire query controller.fire query has become query controller.get contact details, but I haven't changed the name I have used to import. So this name, that is the name of the imported module, can be anything that you want. It need not match the name of the method that you're importing. So that's the case with anything, any imports that you do in Lightning Web Components. Your Apex method name need not match the name of the thing, the imported module name. So I can ideally use the same thing here. I can replace this with ABC, and then I would use ABC here. So it's just a matter of what is it that you named inside your own class, while this is going to change or not. That is totally dependent on you. So that was one question. Okay, I see a lot of very good comments. So thank you guys that you found it helpful. I know that some parts may be a little bit confusing because JavaScript is inherently a little bit tricky to understand. It is a loosely typed language, so it might happen. How come there isn't parenthesis on line 31? Okay, let me look at that. Okay, so if you're talking about this, This is technically the destructured object syntax that I was talking about. So this represents email address colon email address is how it works. You need not really have any double quotes anywhere, um, unless of course you're passing a string value. Is the JavaScript exam for SFDC coming soon? So yeah, I definitely heard an announcement about a new certification that is coming out that is specific to JavaScript. I'm covered by Safe Harbor, so even I don't really know about when it is going to be launched. But stay tuned. Yes, there is already a beta exam that is done. But I think because of these new unprecedented times that we are going through, I heard some of the exams have been postponed. So not too many details on that, but yes, there is a certification coming out on JavaScript. Can we use LWC components other than Salesforce? So I think we need to be more specific here. You can definitely use LWC outside of Salesforce using Lightning Out. You can definitely embed it in a third-party website. And if you want to deploy Lightning Web Components on systems other than Salesforce, for example, like Heroku or Google Cloud, we have also launched Lightning Web Components open source, which is a way in which you can use the same Lightning Web Components to deploy it on non-Salesforce platforms. So yeah, there is a lot of work happening over there. So if I was not able to answer any of your questions, please definitely reach out to me on Twitter or LinkedIn. You can find me by my Twitter handle Aditya Nag, ADITYANAAG, or you can find me on LinkedIn with the same name, Aditya Nag. So please reach out to me. Don't hesitate to ask me any questions. I'll try to answer the best way I can. Of course, because your question and answer is not going to be live, I can definitely do my own research before getting back to you. So with that, I think I'll go to the last slide. That is thank you. Thank you all for your patience. Thank you all for taking the time out of your Saturday to attend my session. And is there anything else that you would like to say? Back to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Aditya, for the great session. There are lots of learning, and thank you everyone for the joining.